get this. Hospitals were targeted by hackers recently, and the method they used, pagers.
It really makes you think twice about technologies we assume are obsolete.
It's like, who even uses pagers anymore, right? Well, for this deep dive, we're looking at a podcast episode about a cyber attack that exposed just that the vulnerability of those systems we think are just dinosaurs in the digital age.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny, the podcast actually asked listeners right off the bat if they thought pagers were still in use today. What do you think they were going for with that?
It's a great way to grab your attention because, honestly, who thinks about pagers these days, let alone their security implications?
Exactly. Out of sight, out of mind, right? Except they're not out of sight. Turns out millions of pagers are still used in hospitals every single day. Millions.
It really underscores the reasons why pagers have persisted, especially in healthcare. They're just so reliable, and in situations where lives are at stake, reliability is paramount.
So let's talk about that reliability for a second. One thing the podcast really emphasized was how pagers work even when cell service is unreliable. That's huge in hospitals, especially during emergencies.
Absolutely. They're like those old Nokia phones that could survive anything. Remember those? You could drop them, they'd still work. Hospitals need that kind of dependability. Doctors need to communicate instantly, no matter what, and pagers deliver on that.
Yeah, like those old Nokia phones, indestructible. But that brings up a big question for me. If pagers are so simple, how did hackers manage to exploit them?
Well, I think this situation shows how it's usually the things we overlook that end up being the biggest problems. And this is especially true when it comes to cybersecurity.
So true.
Like in this case, it wasn't some super complicated code or malware that caused this whole mess for hospitals. It was how simple the technology itself is.
The podcast really made that clear. They said the hackers basically just took advantage of the fact that most pager transmissions aren't encrypted. It's like using one of those old police scanners to listen in, about as low-tech as it gets, but in this case, really effective.
Exactly. And what's even more concerning is that this isn't just about pagers. Any system that sends data but doesn't have the right security measures in place is a target.
They talked to a cybersecurity expert, Dr. Maria Jensen, and she said something that really stuck with me. She said, pager simplicity, in this case, is also their vulnerability. Kind of ironic when you think about it, isn't it? What makes them so reliable also makes them easy to attack.
Yeah, it shows how we often choose functionality over security. But as we see from this attack, that can be a big mistake.
For sure. This really drives home how important it is to constantly be checking our systems for weaknesses. We can't just assume that because something has always worked, it's still safe. The digital world changes so fast, and the threats do too.
Absolutely. And it's not just about finding outdated tech. It's about creating a culture where everyone's aware of security, both in companies and just individually.
You've got to always be prepared, right? Speaking of being prepared, the podcast asked listeners to imagine this. Your company still uses older tech, maybe not quite as old as pagers, but, not exactly cutting edge either. Would you rather have speed and reliability, even if it means there might be security holes? Or would you go with top-notch security and maybe have to sacrifice some speed and efficiency? It's a tough call.
It is a tricky balance, and it's something a lot of industries are grappling with. It's easy to fall into that, if it ain't broke, don't fix it mindset, Even when we know there are risks, this whole pager situation really highlights why we can't let our guard down when it comes to cybersecurity.
Sure.
It's not enough to just react after something happens.
Exactly. Like they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And one thing the podcast made clear was that this isn't just a healthcare problem. They were talking about government agencies, emergency services, even manufacturing. Basically, it sounds like anywhere that still relies on older systems could be vulnerable. We tend to think if something's outdated, hackers won't bother with it, but clearly that's not true at all.
You're right. We can't make assumptions like that. The thing is, the digital world doesn't really care how we classify technology. If there's data being transmitted, someone can try to get to it. And we've seen how even systems that seem outdated can have huge consequences if they're compromised.
Okay, so what can people actually do? I remember the podcast had some pretty practical advice, right?
Yeah, they did. They said it's essential to do regular security checks, basically asking, when was the last time we really took a hard look at our systems? They also said it's super important to encrypt all communications, no matter what technology you're using. It's like locking your front door. You wouldn't leave it unlocked even if you live in a safe neighborhood, right?
Such a good analogy. And it's not just about tech, is it? They talked about training employees, too, so they can spot things like phishing emails or other tricks that hackers use.
Yeah, investing in training is often overlooked, but it's one of the most effective things you can do to strengthen your security.
Hmm.
I mean, think about it. Even the most secure system in the world is vulnerable if someone accidentally hands over the keys, right?
So true. Now, we had a couple of really interesting listener questions, and one that came up was this. Why not just get rid of pagers altogether? Just switch to smartphones, problem solve, right? But I'm guessing it's not quite that simple.
You're right, it's not. The podcast did address that. And they said that while smartphones definitely have a lot of advantages and they have the potential for better security for hospitals, it's still a trade-off between reliability and the possibility of new vulnerabilities. They brought up a good point. Pagers just work. Even if cell service is spotty, even when networks are overloaded during emergencies, pagers keep working. And when you're talking about critical situations, reliable communication can literally mean the difference between life and death.
Wow, that really puts it in perspective. So it seems like gradually moving towards more secure systems is important, but it also sounds like hospitals have to find ways to address those concerns about reliability too.
Right, it's a balancing act.
This whole discussion made me think, could this type of attack, this pager hack, happen in other industries?
Definitely. If an industry relies on legacy systems, especially if it's transmitting sensitive data without encrypting it, then it could be at risk. Think about things like industrial control systems that are used in manufacturing or software that's outdated but still running critical infrastructure. This pager thing should really be a wake-up call for any organization, no matter what sector they're in.
It makes you realize cybersecurity is about so much more than just having the newest technology or the most up-to-date software. It's about understanding the systems we depend on, knowing where the weak spots are, and then being proactive to reduce those risks.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's been fascinating to really dig into this topic. We started with something that seems so specific, hackers going after pagers, who would have thought? But it's opened up this much bigger conversation about cybersecurity, especially in a world where legacy systems are still everywhere.
I know, it's been a wild ride. We've gone from what seemed like retro tech to these really crucial questions about how we balance speed, reliability, and security in a world that's more and more interconnected every day. So here's our final thought for you today. Think about the technology you use every day. Are there any pagers in your life? Systems you rely on that might seem outdated but could still be a security risk? It's definitely something to think about, maybe even do a little investigating. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.